Greetings and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Orly Kroos, and our guest today is Dr. Janos Kocsis. Dr. Kocsis holds a master's degree and a PhD in sociology from the ELTE University of Budapest, in addition to a master's degree in electrical engineering and urban history. Since 2003, Janos has taught at the Department of Sociology and Communication at the Budapest University of Technology and Economics. Currently, he serves as the George Runke Hungarian Chair Visiting Professor for the Department of Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University, where he teaches economics of urban development, architecture, and communication to graduate students. He is a published expert in the fields of urbanization and sociospatial and economic transformation of communities in Central Europe. Today, Dr. Kocsis will be speaking about urban transformation in Hungary and its political, economic, and cultural impact. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. To begin with, can you talk a little bit about the urban renewal that's happening in Hungary? Who started this movement, and how have you seen this trend affecting other Central European countries?
So this trend started probably 30 years ago. There were some initiatives to regenerate the inner cities areas of the capital cities in Central Europe. The problem was that there was a lack of demand and lack of purchasing power from the people, so it was a very long process, very slow process. But then it started around the end of the last decade of the 20th century, that young people, especially students, started to flock into the city centers, and they started to rejuvenate these areas that we call studentification. And in consequence, loads of businesses sprang up. First restaurants, then other services, and then these people started to run their own tiny businesses, creative businesses, and all sorts of tiny things, artistic enterprises, and new venues sprang up in these areas. And after a short while, the municipalities realized the demand for the regeneration, so they started to run their own programs for that. So they refurbished the streets, the facades of the buildings, and which led to a general regeneration in the area. It started a bit earlier, for instance, in Prague, where the tourists, especially the young British tourists, they're infamous young British tourists in the 1990s, which were followed then by loads of other people, and which actually led to a very quick renewal of the city center of Prague. But it started in Warsaw, in Krakow, in other areas, and it started in Budapest a bit later, and with different perspectives. So it's in a way recreated the inner city areas. People used to go out from the city center for the suburbs, affluential people, but the young people are bored in the suburbs, so they want to have fun, want to run their own businesses, so they went back to the central areas, and in a way they recreated these areas. Of course, it's an interesting process because these areas are aging, the populations are aging, which in consequence leads to some tensions between the new, young, and affluential people and the older generations, which have much lower social standards and purchasing power.
What other political, cultural, or economic impacts have occurred as a result of the revival in Budapest? And how has this purchasing power of these new communities really affected the inner city?
It affected in loads of ways. For instance, because the municipalities want to have money, they rely on taxation of these new businesses, so they want to go for these businesses, whereas the older generations wants to have a quiet neighborhood. And sometimes it doesn't work out right. I mean, imagine a young couple who moved in these areas in the 60s, and they've been living there for 40, 60 years, and all of a sudden you have hundreds of young people at 2 o'clock in the morning on the streets and doing all kinds of things, which are very exciting, but still. But because the municipalities and the local economy relies on these new activities, the local politicians more or less favor these initiatives and enterprises. So there is a change. But the problem is that these people don't really move to these areas, so they're not residential in these terms. The old people are residents there, which creates a strange tension in these areas.
So these new young people that have arrived in the inner city and they're now starting businesses and they're young entrepreneurs, how are they shaping the business climate within the cities?
Because they're very creative. So creativity is very important for them. They're not very much. They don't have a lot of knowledge how to run businesses. So this is a huge problem for them. They lack experiences, but they go for these businesses, and they have lots of new ideas, not just artistic ideas and culinary ideas, but other sorts of ideas. So it leads to a revival of the city center, but not in this term that it used to be. So it's less consumerism. It's more about small shops, small businesses, small entrepreneurial activities instead of these big department stores or things like that.
And how has the urban landscape in Central Europe changed as a result? Has it expanded beyond the cities at this point?
The city centers in Central Europe are large compared to the American city centers. So in Budapest is 1.7 million inhabitants, including the metropolitan area is probably 3 million people. But it has, the size of the city center is comparable to the size of the city center of Chicago, which is 3 times as much. So there's a lot of empty spaces. And actually these empty spaces also create economic activities, because you can lease a venue for very cheap prices, very nice venues. I wouldn't say it looks like Detroit because it's not empty, but there are very nice places for affordable prices, even in the inner areas of the cities. And there's a transitional zone where loads of technical enterprises sprang up in the last decade or so. So there is a lot of places in the inner areas. Going back to your question, there is economic activities in the suburbs, the phenomenon which we call the edge city phenomenon, that sprang up especially before the crisis of 2008. Since then it stopped a bit. But nonetheless, there are some activities there, but it's a different kind of activity. So it's more big business than these small entrepreneurial activities. You need more money to run a business in the greenfield areas, to set up a venue, set up a building. In the central areas, they are all there, so you can just lease them for very affordable prices.
You had mentioned the municipalities earlier, and I was wondering, how has the political landscape in terms of the municipalities' function and role changed as a result of the urbanization?
They have to be more active. They have to negotiate with the business people, and they were used to having to negotiate with the planners and with the governmental actors. And nowadays, beside them, they have to negotiate with the entrepreneurs, with the different people, representatives of the residents, which creates new challenges for them. But in a way, it creates a new phase of possibilities also. How to regenerate these areas, how to involve more and more people into the processes, not just rely on central initiatives, but to include more and more actions on behalf of the local people and on behalf of especially the young people who are very active, and they have, let's say, they have different attitudes than the old ones, because they lived in the market economy, not the old ones who used to grow up in the socialist economy.
Very interesting. It seems like there's a real dynamic movement that's happening right now. For an American business who's looking to invest in Hungary or other Central European countries, what opportunities exist for them?
It depends actually on which scale. Let me talk about the small scale, which I think is more interesting. The Hungarians are very talented, well-skilled, but they have little experience how to run effectively an enterprise. So running an enterprise and having creative people and setting up a business could be a very nice initiative on behalf of the American entrepreneurs in Central Europe. How to go to the market, how to marketize things. So it's very important, and the local population is not very experienced in these terms. On the other hand, for small and medium enterprises, IT sector is a nice place to go. Pharmaceutical activities and logistics, and because these areas, Central Europe is in a way gateway to the southeastern areas of the Eurasian continent, not just Europe, but also a gateway from east to the west. So it could be it's not could be, but it's already a center of these activities, of these international activities. So there are loads of headquarters of international companies, also those services that are for these companies, like marketing and researchers.
Dr. Kocsis, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you coming and speaking with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. That's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics or guests, please contact us at cyber@indiana.edu.